For this project, I'll be building a live edge cherry bench for my dad's mudroom. He had a surplus of old rough cut cherry wood that I would use for building this, so I measured and sketched out a bench that would fit the space. And it was time to get started. The ends weren't square, so I started by squaring up the pieces I would use. The miter saw would give me a close to square edge to base all my measurements off of. I'm using a speed square as more of a straight edge for making these marks, just in case it's not perfectly square. I focused on using the sections containing the most prominent live edges for this. I did this for the legs and the 45 supports as well. This square piece will be used for support under the bench. This one will not have a live edge, and that's pretty much because I couldn't find a piece with enough live edge to span the whole length. Now that all the cuts were made, it's time to remove all the bark. I will remove the majority of it so I can run the cuts through the planer. That way I don't have to worry about damaging or dulling the planer blades. This part where I chisel off all the bark was actually super satisfying. After removing the bark with a chisel, I used a wire brush to remove any leftover material. And then I repeated this for the legs as well. All the boards were done and ready for the planer. I wanted a 1-inch thickness for the board, so I planed them to about 1 1/8 inches to accommodate for sanding. I didn't want to remove too much of the live edge details, so I removed the majority of the material from the flat edges to get the correct thickness. I love the grain detail of this cherry. I can't wait to see how the other pieces turn out. Once the bottoms were cleaned up and flat, I ran the live edge sides through just to clean the surface. They turned out great. I love the lighter grain accents around the live edges. The two larger pieces will be glued up and used as the top of the bench. But unfortunately the depth was too much for the space, so I marked 1 1/2 inches on the live edge piece. Drew my line. And made the cut. Slight hiccup with the clamp placement. They were in the way of the circular saw. That's much better. Unfortunately, the seam where the boards would glue up together had a lot of gaps, so I laid out the boards to run a cut down the seam where these pieces would touch. I made sure I didn't apply too much inward pressure, that way I wouldn't pinch the saw blade. Although this helped, there were still some gaps between the boards. So I marked the sections that would need to be adjusted and brought them inside. The middle had a substantial gap, so if I remove some material from the outer thirds, it should fit together better. I started off with sanding the board sections with 120 grit paper. Unfortunately, I had difficulty getting a square edge with sanding though. You can see how uneven the sanding is, especially by the bottom. So I ended up switching over to a hand planer to make these adjustments. This worked out a lot better and the gaps were practically gone. Well, except for that spot right there. After correcting that spot, I made 5 guide marks for the joining jig. I don't have a lot of experience with dowel joinery, so my guide measurements may have been a bit excessive. I basically made it impossible to misalign the drill holes. I then marked the center of each board for setting the drill guide height. I'll be using 3/8 inch dowels for joining these pieces. I'm not sponsored by Pony, but I highly recommend these Sawhorses if you don't have a dedicated workspace. They make glue-ups in small projects like this a lot easier. I then set up a drill stop marking half the dowel length plus the thickness of the MilesCraft jig, and drilled 2 dowel holes for each mark, totaling in 10 dowels altogether. I did this for both boards and had to be careful not to damage the live edge by making the clamps too tight. I double checked to make sure all the dowels were aligned, and fortunately they were. Some of them were a little too snug for comfort though, so I went back and cleaned up the drill holes with the same drill bit. I used Titebond 3 for gluing all the dowels in these boards together. I also used a wooden mallet to not damage or mar the wood. No turning back now. Let's hope this goes smoothly. The live edge made hammering these together more difficult than I had imagined, and forced me to work in some awkward positions. But the pieces were clamped together and the edges were almost perfect. This edge was a little off, but nothing I can't fix. After this, I ran another bead of glue along the seam and sprinkled on some cherry sawdust. My hope with this was to be able to have as seamless of a gap as possible when it comes time to sand. While that dried, I began working on the supports. This piece would have to be cut in half, so here I'm measuring the width in 3 spots. There was only a 1/16 of an inch deviation with these measurements, so the board was pretty close to square. So I marked a center line and ripped the board in half. I originally wanted to get 2 45-degree cuts out of this piece, but the piece wasn't large enough. So I made some adjustments and had to look for another live edge piece. The only other live edge piece I could find had a huge crack at the end. Fortunately, the live edge section missed this crack and could be salvageable. I got pretty lucky that these boards had a similar grain pattern. I probably would have had to rethink the design if there were no more live edge pieces. So I ended up removing the bark and I planed this board to match the thickness of the others. And this is the intended layout for the base supports underneath the bench. The next day, the glue up was dry and it was time to start sanding. I started off with 80 grit to get the surfaces nice and even. I then moved up to 120 grit to finish evening the wood. I repeated this process for the bottom of the bench and all the other pieces as well. Next, I sprayed each of the boards with water to help the fibers pop. This is called water popping. This will cause the grain to become more pronounced and open up the wood pores. Once dried, this will result in a much smoother finish after sanding, and it will also help the oil penetrate more evenly. Unfortunately, I got a little ahead of myself though and completely forgot to clean the edges first. So I'll wait for the wood to dry and then I'll sand the edges clean. I'm using 120 grit for getting the edges of these boards all cleaned up. Now I can finish the faces of all the boards. For this I use 220 grit on all the boards. I will do one final sand with 320 grit once the bench is assembled. With all the pieces sanded, it was time to start assembling the base. My idea for the base was to have pocket holes drilled into the longer pieces connecting them to the bench. Having pocket holes on the inside of the supports would also hide mounting points for a cleaner look. So I laid out the base and got everything squared up and centered to the bench. Then I drew a very light guideline for where everything would be mounted. I then marked 4 inches from the edges and one spot in the center of the supports to use as a guide for the pocket hole jig. The arrows are to mark what side the pocket holes will be drilled through. Thanks, Dad, for letting me borrow your pocket hole jig. I haven't used a pocket hole jig before, so I'm testing it out on some scrap cherry boards first. I measured the thickness of the scrap board and made all the jig adjustments. I had to adjust the clamp of this jig quite a bit to get the right amount of pressure for holding this board in place, so I'm glad I got this figured out on the test piece. The pocket holes turned out pretty good. The scrap pieces are far from square, but I mainly wanted to figure out an appropriate clutch setting for fastening the cherry together. So after some adjustments, I got the joint nice and sturdy. Now it was time for the actual boards. The smooth surface is definitely made for much cleaner pocket holes. Polly decided to come and pay me a visit at the start of the second board. If you're wondering why I'm squatting down so much, it's because I'm lining up the jig with the guidelines underneath the board. All the pocket holes lined up, and now it was time to fasten them to the bench. To fasten them, I'll be using Kreg's fine 1 1/4 inch pocket hole screws. So the mudroom this bench will go in is not insulated very well, and the temperatures fluctuate rapidly with the seasons. I didn't use wood glue because of this, but I could be wrong. Please let me know in the comments if temperatures would have an impact on something like this. But moving along, I sandwiched the 45s in place and mounted the second support. The 45-degree pieces would help hide and cover the outer pocket holes. Now to attach the 45s to the supports. I tested out using a countersink and plug on a scrap piece of cherry to see if this was a good idea for mounting them. I didn't use any glue for this plug. I didn't think it was necessary since it was just for testing. But I actually really like how these look, so I'm going to do this for the 45s and the legs. I had to make sure that the screw placements for these wouldn't overlap with the pocket holes on the inside. I also had to stagger the placement of them, so the back screws are 2 inches from the side while the front are 1 inch. Here's a better look at what I meant by staggering them. So this is the 1 inch side, and then over here is the 2 inch side. Next, I measured the pilot holes for the legs. I pre-drilled the holes from the inside, and then countersank them from the outside. Then I pre-drilled the holes for the 45s and the supports. And then attach the legs. Now it was time to make all the plugs. I definitely need to get a new plug cutter. I would periodically stop and spray the bit with water so it wouldn't burn the wood. But I added a small amount of Titebond 3 to the edges and used a mallet to insert them in the countersink holes. When doing this, I made sure the grain direction of the plugs and the bench lined up. While the plugs dried, I measured the back of the bench to find a good center point. To use my new branding iron. I tested this on a different piece earlier, which is why it doesn't look so new. But I heated up for about 5 minutes with a blowtorch, then pressed down around the center of the board. And ta-da! With the logo burning complete, it was time to let the plugs dry overnight. The next day I chiseled the plugs flush and regretted not cutting the plugs to a shorter length. Chiseling these flush put me in some weird angles and I unfortunately made some marks in the wood. Fortunately enough, though, the marks weren't too deep and I was able to sand the areas clean after. After I sanded the entire piece with 320 grit to give it a nice smooth finish, I then vacuumed all the dust off the bench. After I brought the bench inside to prevent temperature changes from impacting the oil application, for this bench I'll be using tung oil varnish. I used a staining sponge instead of a rag for a more even coat. I mean, it's not to say the sponge is better than a rag, I just had better luck with them. I had to dab the stain on the live edges though to avoid tons of fibers from getting into the wood. I love the color of this varnish on the cherry wood. The first coat came out great, and the sponge allowed for me to get in between the gaps of the supports. Unfortunately, the only downside was there was a good amount of pilting around the live edges. It's just pulling fiber off of the sponge. Maybe some steel wool will remove the pilting. Nope.
That was stupid.
Attempt number 1 was definitely a fail. Maybe a nylon brush. And all this did was move it around. My third attempt was using tape to remove the pilting. And third time's the charm, it worked really well. So before the second coat, I wrapped the sponge in tape and removed the tape to get rid of a majority of the lint. I still had to be careful around the live edges for the second coat. But the second coat turned out great. A lot less pilting and fabric fibers around the live edges. Now to let this cure and begin varnishing the top. I must have accidentally touched the top while working on the bottom. Hopefully these fingerprints don't show up after the varnish. If they do, I'll have to sand it. I applied the varnish in the direction of the wood grain with a new sponge and dabbed it along the live edges. The lighter grain immediately absorbed the oil, so this will definitely need a few coats. After about 5 hours, I applied the second coat. And, like the first coat, the lighter grain immediately absorbed the oil. You can see the lack of reflection along the lighter edge and the absence of oil. So, 3 coats it is. By the third coat, the lighter grains seem to be drying at the same rate as the rest of the wood, so once this cures, I'll begin applying the wax to protect the wood. The next day, I checked on how the wood was curing, and unfortunately, the previous coat didn't absorb all the way, and it dried with a glossy finish. I really wanted a matte finish for this bench, so I'll have to fix this. So to fix it, I picked up some fine steel wool and lightly scrubbed in the direction of the grain. The live edges were more difficult and had a lot of grooves I couldn't reach into with the steel wool. So I did my best and got as much of the gloss off as I could, and then I vacuumed the bench to remove all the small steel wool fibers. I also used some tape on the live edges just to be safe. For the wax, I'm using Old Master's Crystal Clear Paste Wax. To apply it, I used a rag and rubbed it in a circular motion into the wood. Once the wax was worked into the wood, I went over the top in the direction of the grain. I'm not sure if direction matters for applying wax, it's just more of a force of habit. I let the wax sit for a few minutes and then applied a second coat. I used 2 coats since this is a new piece and the top will receive a lot of wear over time. After I borrowed my dad's old car buffer and buffed the top of the bench. This gave the top of the bench a very smooth shine. This kind of shine felt more natural than the glossy finish present before using the steel wool. I really liked how it looked and felt. And just like that, the bench was all done. And Polly wanted to say hi again, apparently. I really like the varnish color of the cherry wood. While the plugs are more noticeable than intended, I actually don't hate the look of them. I think it looks pretty nice. Some things to note for future builds, however, are to work on getting tighter joints to prevent gaps from showing. Running these edges along a table saw blade instead of a circular saw probably could have helped with this. And for some odd reason, the lighter grain along the live edge didn't absorb the varnish as evenly as the rest of the bench. It did the same on the legs as well. I don't know why that is. But overall, I'm very happy with how this turned out and can't wait to work with live edges again in the future. Let me know in the comments what you think and if you have any tips or ideas for my next project. Thank you all for watching.